The sun cast long shadows across the dusty plains of Wyoming Territory as Daisy Grayson collapsed at the river's edge, her body shaking with sobs that seemed to come from the depths of her soul. The rushing waters of the North Platte did little to drown out her cries as she clutched a crumpled letter in her trembling hands, the ink smudged with tears. She had lost everything: her home, her family's ranch, and any hope for the future she'd once dreamed of. Quincy Hayes hadn't meant to intrude on such a private moment of grief. He'd simply been leading his horse to water after a long day of riding fence lines for the neighboring Diamondback Ranch. At 26, Quincy had seen his share of hardship in the unforgiving landscape of 1876 Wyoming, but something about the young woman's despair made him pause. Her honey-brown hair had come loose from its pins, cascading down her back as her shoulders heaved with each heart-wrenching sob. He approached slowly, not wanting to startle her. "Madam," he called softly, his voice carrying just above the sound of the flowing water. "Are you all right?" Daisy's head snapped up, her tear-stained face flushing with embarrassment at being discovered in such a state. She hastily wiped at her cheeks, though fresh tears replaced those she'd cleared away. "I'm fine," she insisted, her voice breaking on the obvious lie. "Please, just leave me be." Quincy removed his hat, holding it respectfully against his chest. The gesture was small, but it was one his father had taught him long ago when approaching someone in distress. "I don't mean to intrude, but you seem far from fine," he said gently. "Is there something I can do to help?" A bitter laugh escaped her lips. "Unless you can resurrect the dead or restore a family's fortune, I'm afraid not." She looked away, her gaze fixed on the rushing water. "My father died 3 days ago. The bank is taking our ranch. I have nowhere to go." Quincy's weathered face softened with genuine concern. He took a tentative step closer, then crouched down a respectful distance from her. "I'm mighty sorry to hear that, Miss Grayson," she supplied after a moment's hesitation. "Daisy Grayson, Miss Grayson," he acknowledged with a slight nod. "Quincy Hayes, I work over at the Diamondback." Daisy looked at him then, really looked at him. His face was tanned from years under the sun, with lines around his eyes that spoke of both laughter and hardship. His dark hair curled slightly where it met the collar of his worn denim shirt, and his eyes, a deep, steady blue, held no judgment, only concern. "My father built that ranch from nothing," she said, her voice steadier now. 20 years of his life, and mine too. And now, because of some debts I knew nothing about, it's all gone." She crumpled the letter further in her hand. "The banker gave me 3 days to clear out, 3 days to pack up 2 decades of memories." Quincy shifted uncomfortably, knowing all too well how quickly fortunes could change in this harsh territory. "Where will you go?" Daisy shook her head, a fresh tear tracking down her cheek. "I don't know. I have an aunt in Denver, but we haven't spoken in years. I don't even know if she's still alive." Without thinking, Quincy reached out, his calloused thumb gently brushing away the tear from her cheek. The gesture surprised them both, and he quickly withdrew his hand. "I'm sorry, that was forward of me," but Daisy didn't recoil. Instead, she looked at him with a vulnerability that made something in his chest tighten. "No, thank you." A moment of silence passed between them, filled only by the sounds of the river and the distant call of a hawk. Quincy cleared his throat. "Miss Grayson, I know we're strangers, but I can't in good conscience leave you out here alone with night coming on. The Diamondback's got a bunkhouse with a small room at the back. It ain't much, but it's clean, and you'd be safe there while you figure things out." Daisy hesitated, weighing her limited options. "I couldn't impose. It's no imposition. Mrs. Holloway, the cook, would be glad for some female company, I reckon." He smiled slightly, the expression warming his features. "She's been trying to civilize a bunch of cowboys for years with little success." A small, tentative smile touched Daisy's lips, the first Quincy had seen. It transformed her face, hinting at the spirit that grief had temporarily dimmed. "Are you sure your boss won't mind?" "Mr. Donovan's a fair man. He wouldn't turn away someone in need, especially not the daughter of a neighboring rancher." Quincy stood, offering his hand. "What do you say, at least for tonight?" Daisy looked at his outstretched hand for a long moment. Then, making her decision, she placed her smaller hand in his and allowed him to help her to her feet. "Just for tonight," she agreed softly. As they walked toward his horse, Quincy had no way of knowing that "just for tonight" would be the beginning of a journey that would change both their lives forever. All he knew was that something about this woman, her courage in the face of loss, the quiet dignity beneath her tears, stirred something in him he'd never felt before. "I promise you'll be all right, Miss Grayson," he said, as he helped her onto his horse before mounting behind her. "That's a promise I intend to keep." And though neither of them realized it then, as the setting sun painted the Wyoming sky in shades of gold and crimson, that promise was the first of many he would make to her, promises that would ultimately lead to forever. The ride to the Diamondback Ranch was quiet, save for the rhythmic sound of hoofbeats and the occasional distant lowing of cattle. Daisy sat stiffly in front of Quincy, acutely aware of his solid presence behind her. His arms encircled her as he held the reins, creating a circle of unexpected security that both comforted and unsettled her. "It's not much further," Quincy said, breaking the silence as they crested a small rise. Below them, the Diamondback spread out in the fading light, a collection of sturdy buildings surrounding the main ranch house, with corrals and a barn off to one side. Lanterns were already being lit, their warm glow punctuating the approaching dusk. Daisy nodded, not trusting her voice. The reality of her situation was setting in. 22 years old and suddenly alone in the world, accepting help from a stranger. What would her father say? Arthur Grayson had been a proud man, self-reliant to a fault, but he was gone now and she had to make her own decisions. As they approached the ranch, a stocky man with iron-gray hair emerged from the barn, his eyebrows rising in surprise at the sight of Quincy returning with a woman. "Hayes, didn't expect you back so soon," the man called out. His gaze shifted to Daisy, curiosity evident in his weathered face. And with company no less, Quincy reined in his horse and dismounted before helping Daisy down. "Mr. Donovan, this is Miss Daisy Grayson. She's Arthur Grayson's daughter from the Triple G." Recognition flashed in Donovan's eyes. "Arthur's girl, I heard about your father's passing." "My condolences, Miss Grayson." "Thank you, Mr. Donovan," Daisy replied softly. Quincy shifted his weight, hat in hand. "Miss Grayson is in a difficult situation. The bank's foreclosing on the Triple G and she needs a place to stay, at least for the night." "I thought perhaps the back room in the bunkhouse." Donovan frowned, shaking his head. "The bunkhouse, that's no place for a lady." He turned to Daisy with unexpected gentleness. "Miss Grayson, we have a spare room in the main house." "My wife would skin me alive if I let Arthur Grayson's daughter sleep in the bunkhouse when we have a proper bed available." Relief washed over Quincy's face. "Thank you, sir. No need for thanks, it's what neighbors do." Donovan gestured toward the main house. "Come along, Miss Grayson. Martha will get you settled." As they walked toward the house, Daisy glanced back at Quincy, who stood holding the reins of his horse, watching them go. Their eyes met briefly, and she offered a small nod of gratitude. He touched the brim of his hat in response, a gesture both respectful and reassuring. Martha Donovan proved to be a whirlwind of efficiency and kindness. Within an hour of Daisy's arrival, she had been shown to a modest but comfortable bedroom, provided with a clean nightgown and toiletries, and seated at the dining table with a hearty bowl of stew in front of her. "You're far too thin, dear," Martha declared, placing a basket of freshly baked biscuits on the table. "Grief will do that, I know, but you must keep up your strength." Daisy managed a small smile. "You're very kind, Mrs. Donovan." "Nonsense, I'm just doing what anyone would do." Martha sat down across from her. "Now, eat up while it's hot. We can talk about what comes next when you've got some food in you." Daisy hadn't realized how hungry she was until the first spoonful of stew passed her lips. She'd barely eaten since receiving news of her father's death, subsisting on cold coffee and stale bread as she tried to make sense of the scattered papers in his study. Searching for some way to save the ranch, as she ate, the back door opened and Quincy stepped into the kitchen, hat in hand. He'd clearly cleaned up, his face freshly washed and his hair damp at the temples. Mrs. Donovan, I just wanted to check if Miss Grayson was settling in all right, he said, his eyes finding Daisy's across the room. Martha smiled knowingly. She's just fine, Quincy. Having her first decent meal in days, I'd wager. Quincy nodded, seeming almost awkward now in the warm, domestic setting of the kitchen, a stark contrast to his confident demeanor by the river. That's good, that's real good. He cleared his throat. Well, I'll leave you ladies to it then. Nonsense, Martha declared. Sit down and have some stew, I made plenty. A flicker of something hesitation, hope, crossed Quincy's face before he nodded and took a seat at the table, leaving an empty chair between himself and Daisy. They ate in companionable silence for a few minutes before Martha spoke again. Quincy tells me the bank is taking your father's ranch, Daisy. Is there no way to stop it? Daisy set down her spoon, the reminder souring the comfort of the meal. No. My father apparently took out loans I knew nothing about. The banker, Mr. Wells, showed me the papers with his signature. The debt is considerable and with no means to pay it. She trailed off, the reality of her situation settling over her like a heavy blanket. That Wells is a vulture, Quincy muttered, then looked apologetic. Begging your pardon for the language, Miss Grayson. No need, Daisy replied, a flash of fire in her eyes. I've called him worse in private. This startled a laugh out of Quincy, the sound warm and genuine. Martha looked between them with interest before rising from the table. I'll fetch some coffee, she announced, though neither Quincy nor Daisy seemed to notice her departure. You have any family you can go to? Quincy asked once they were alone. Daisy shook her head. Just that aunt in Denver I mentioned. My mother died when I was 8 and father never remarried. It was always just the two of us and the ranch hands, of course. What about them? The ranch hands. Most left when they realized what was happening. Can't blame them, they need steady work. Daisy sighed. Only old Pete stayed till the end, and he's headed to his daughter's place in Montana. Quincy was quiet for a moment, turning his coffee cup in his hands. What will you do? It was the question Daisy had been avoiding since the banker had delivered the news. I don't know, she admitted. I have some skills. I can keep books, manage a household. Perhaps I could find work as a housekeeper or a teacher, though I have no formal training for the latter. You could stay here, Quincy suggested, the words coming out in a rush. When Daisy looked at him in surprise, he hastened to add, I mean, on the Diamondback. Mrs. Donovan's been saying for months she needs help with the house and the accounts. Mr. Donovan's eyesight isn't what it used to be, and the ledgers are giving him trouble. Daisy considered this, hope and wariness warring within her. I couldn't accept charity. It wouldn't be charity, Quincy insisted. It would be a job, fair pay for fair work. He leaned forward slightly. At least think about it. Give yourself a few days to rest before making any decisions. Before Daisy could respond, Martha returned with the coffee pot and a plate of apple tart. The conversation shifted to lighter topics, but Quincy's suggestion lingered in Daisy's mind. Later that night, as she lay in the unfamiliar bed, staring at the shadows on the ceiling, Daisy allowed herself to consider the possibility of staying. The Diamondback was only a few miles from what had been her home. She wouldn't have to leave the land she loved entirely. And there was something about Quincy Hayes, the kindness in his eyes when he'd found her by the river, the gentle way he'd wiped away her tears that made her feel less alone for the first time since her father's death. Just a few days, she whispered to herself in the darkness. Just until I figure things out. But even as she drifted off to sleep, a small voice in the back of her mind whispered that perhaps her future might be found right here on the Diamondback Ranch with a blue-eyed cowboy who had promised she would be all right. Dawn broke clear and cold the following morning, painting the eastern sky with strokes of pink and gold that gradually pushed back the night's darkness. Daisy woke early, years of ranch life having ingrained in her the habit of rising with the sun. For a disorienting moment, she didn't recognize her surroundings, but then the events of the previous day came flooding back. She dressed quickly in the same clothes she'd worn yesterday, the only ones she had with her, and made her way downstairs. The house was quiet, but a light already burned in the kitchen, where she found Martha kneading dough at the large wooden table. "Good morning, dear," Martha greeted her, not missing a beat in her rhythmic working of the dough. "Sleep well, better than I expected," Daisy admitted. "Can I help with anything?" Martha smiled approvingly. "You can start the coffee if you like, pot's on the stove." Daisy set about the familiar task, grateful to have something useful to do. As she worked, Martha continued kneading, her strong hands sure and practiced. "Quincy mentioned you might be looking for work," Martha said casually, though Daisy sensed the older woman was watching her reaction carefully. "He mentioned that you might need help with the house and accounts," Daisy confirmed, measuring coffee grounds into the pot. Martha nodded. "That boy's observant, I'll give him that. Yes, I could use the help. I'm not as young as I used to be, and this place keeps getting bigger. Robert's eyes aren't what they were either. Can't make out the figures in the ledgers without getting a headache." "I kept all the books for my father," Daisy said, a hint of pride in her voice. "He said I had a head for numbers." "Then it sounds like a perfect arrangement," Martha said decisively. "You'll stay here, help me with the house, and take over the bookkeeping. We'll pay you a fair wage, and you'll have your own room, of course." Daisy hesitated, the coffee pot in her hands. "It's very generous, but it's not generosity, it's practicality," Martha interrupted firmly. "I need the help, you need the work, there's nothing more to it than that." But there was more to it, Daisy knew. The Donovans could have hired anyone from town. This was an act of kindness toward the daughter of a neighbor who had fallen on hard times. Yet the pride her father had instilled in her rebelled at the idea of accepting what felt like charity. Martha seemed to read her thoughts. "Your father was a proud man, Daisy, but he was also practical. He'd want you to be safe and to make a sensible decision about your future." Tears pricked at Daisy's eyes, but she blinked them away. "You're right," she conceded. "Thank you, Mrs. Donovan. I accept your offer, at least for now, until I can make more permanent arrangements." Martha's face softened. "Good girl. Now let's get breakfast started before the men come in from their morning chores. They eat like wolves, the lot of them." Daisy found herself smiling as she set the coffee to boil. There was comfort in the familiar routine of preparing a meal, in knowing she had a purpose, even temporarily. The kitchen door swung open just as they were setting plates on the table, and Robert Donovan entered, followed by Quincy and 3 other ranch hands. The men stomped their boots and hung their hats by the door, bringing with them the crisp scent of the morning air and the earthy smell of the stables. "Morning, ladies," Robert greeted them. His gaze landed on Daisy with kindly interest. "Hope you slept well, Miss Grayson." "Very well, thank you, Mr. Donovan," Daisy replied. She was acutely aware of Quincy's presence, though he hadn't spoken yet. When she glanced his way, she found him watching her, a question in his eyes. "Daisy's agreed to stay on and help with the house and books," Martha announced as they all took their seats. "I expect you boys to mind your manners with a lady about." The other ranch hands introduced as Tom, Elijah, and Diego murmured their assent, but it was Quincy's reaction Daisy found herself watching. A smile spread across his face, genuine pleasure lighting his eyes. "That's fine news," he said simply. "Real fine news." Breakfast passed in a blur of conversation and hearty appetite. The ranch hands spoke of the day's work ahead, mending the north fence line, moving cattle to the upper pasture, breaking a new horse that had been giving them trouble. Daisy listened, soaking in the familiar rhythms of ranch life that she had feared were lost to her forever. After the meal, as the men were preparing to head out, Quincy lingered behind. He approached Daisy as she was clearing the table, his hat in his hands. "I'm glad you're staying," he said quietly, "even if it's just for now." Daisy looked up at him, struck again by the sincerity in his blue eyes. "Thank you for suggesting it and for everything yesterday." A slight flush colored his tan cheeks. "It was nothing. Anyone would have done the same." "No," Daisy contradicted gently. "Not everyone would have stopped, not everyone would have cared." They stood there for a moment, the breakfast dishes forgotten between them, until Martha's voice broke the spell. "Quincy Hayes, are you planning to stand there all day, or are you going to earn your keep?" she called from the pantry, though there was no real rebuke in her tone. Quincy grinned, settling his hat back on his head. "Yes, madam, right away, madam." He tipped his hat to Daisy. "See you at supper, Miss Grayson." As he left, Daisy felt something shift inside her, a small, almost imperceptible lightening of the grief that had weighed her down. She turned back to the dishes, a thoughtful expression on her face. "That boy's sweet on you already," Martha remarked casually as she returned to the kitchen. Daisy felt her cheeks warm. "Don't be ridiculous, he's just being kind." Martha made a noncommittal sound as she began wiping down the stove. "Quincy Hayes is a good man, hard worker, honest to a fault. Been with the Diamondback for nearly 5 years now. Robert trusts him more than any other hand." Not knowing how to respond, Daisy simply nodded and continued with the dishes. But Martha's words stayed with her as she moved through her first day at the Diamondback, learning the routines of the house, familiarizing herself with the ledgers, and trying not to think too much about the cowboy with the kind eyes who had found her crying by the river. The days that followed fell into a rhythm that was both familiar and new. Daisy rose with the sun, helped Martha prepare breakfast for the hungry ranch hands, then divided her time between household tasks and updating the ranch's accounts. The work was honest and satisfying, and if she sometimes found her gaze drifting to the window when Quincy rode in from the range, well, that was her own private concern. A week after her arrival, Robert Donovan called her into his study after supper. He sat behind a desk cluttered with papers, his reading glasses perched on the end of his nose. "Miss Grayson, I've been looking over your work with the ledgers," he began, gesturing to the open books before him. "I must say, you've done an excellent job bringing order to my chaotic system." "Thank you, Mr. Donovan," Daisy replied, pleased by the compliment. "I'm happy to be of use." "More than useful," he corrected. "You've already identified several areas where we can cut costs without affecting the operation. That's valuable insight." He removed his glasses, regarding her thoughtfully. "Which brings me to the real reason I called you in here. I received word from town today that the bank is putting your father's ranch up for auction next week." The news hit Daisy like a physical blow, though she'd known it was coming. Still, the finality of it, the thought of strangers walking through her childhood home, assessing its value, claiming her father's legacy, made her throat tighten painfully. "I see," she managed, her voice strained. "Thank you for telling me." Robert's expression was compassionate. "I thought you might want to go back before then, to collect any personal items you weren't able to take when you left." Daisy nodded, grateful for his understanding. "Yes, I would like that very much." "Good. Quincy can take you tomorrow. He needs to go to town anyway for supplies." Robert hesitated, then added gently, "You know, Martha and I have been talking. Your position here doesn't have to be temporary, Miss Grayson. We'd be pleased if you decided to stay on permanently." The offer touched Daisy deeply. In just a week, the Donovans had shown her more kindness than she could have hoped for. "That's very generous of you both." "Not generous at all," Robert insisted, echoing his wife's earlier sentiment. "You're earning your keep and then some, just think about it." Daisy promised she would, though in truth, she'd already been considering it. The idea of leaving the Diamondback, of leaving the wide Wyoming skies and the rugged beauty of the land she loved, grew less appealing with each passing day. And if part of her reluctance had to do with a certain blue-eyed cowboy, well, that was a complication she wasn't quite ready to examine too closely. The next morning dawned clear and bright, with just a hint of autumn crispness in the air. Quincy was waiting by the wagon when Daisy emerged from the house, a shawl wrapped around her shoulders against the early chill. "Morning, Miss Grayson," he greeted her, offering a hand to help her up onto the seat. "Ready to head out?" Daisy accepted his hand, trying to ignore the warmth that spread through her at his touch. "As ready as I'll ever be," she replied honestly. Quincy's expression softened with understanding as he climbed up beside her. "It won't be easy going back. But I'll be right there with you if that helps at all." It did help, more than she could say. As they set off down the road, the sun climbing higher in the eastern sky, Daisy found herself stealing glances at Quincy's profile. Over the past week, she'd learned more about him through casual conversations at meals and the occasional moment when their paths crossed during the day. He'd grown up in Colorado, the son of a miner who had died in a cave-in when Quincy was 16. He'd made his way north, working odd jobs until finding a place at the Diamondback, where his natural way with horses and cattle had quickly made him valuable. What she'd learned only increased her admiration for him. He was unfailingly kind to everyone, from Mrs. Holloway the cook to the youngest stable boy. He worked harder than any man on the ranch, yet never boasted or sought praise, and he had a quiet strength about him that Daisy found increasingly compelling. "Can I ask you something, Mr. Hayes?" She ventured as the wagon rumbled along the dusty road. He glanced at her, a smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "Only if you'll start calling me Quincy. Mr. Hayes makes me feel like I'm in trouble with the schoolmaster." Daisy couldn't help returning his smile. "Very well, Quincy. I was wondering why you stopped that day at the river. You could have just ridden on by." He was quiet for a moment, considering her question. "I suppose I couldn't ride past someone in distress any more than I could ignore a wounded animal or a building on fire. It's just not in me to turn away when someone needs help." He looked at her then, his blue eyes serious. "But if I'm being honest, there was something about you, even then, something that made me want to be the one to help if I could." The simple sincerity of his words made Daisy's heart beat a little faster. "Well, I'm glad you stopped," she said softly. "I don't know what I would have done otherwise." "You'd have figured something out," Quincy replied with conviction. "You're stronger than you give yourself credit for, Daisy Grayson." It was the first time he'd used her first name, and the sound of it in his deep voice sent a pleasant shiver down her spine. Before she could respond, however, a familiar landscape came into view ahead: the Triple G Ranch, her home for all of her 22 years. Quincy seemed to sense the shift in her mood. "We can turn back if it's too much," he offered quietly. Daisy shook her head, straightening her shoulders. "No. I need to do this." As they approached the ranch house, Daisy was struck by how quickly a place could go from home to just a collection of buildings. Already there was an air of abandonment about the property. The flower beds she'd tended were withering from neglect, and the porch steps that her father had been meaning to fix now sagged visibly. Quincy brought the wagon to a stop in front of the house and jumped down, coming around to help Daisy descend. This time, when his hands circled her waist to lift her down, they lingered for just a moment longer than necessary. The small gesture of support gave Daisy the courage to approach the front door. The house was unnervingly quiet as they entered. Dust motes danced in the shafts of sunlight that streamed through the windows, and their footsteps echoed on the wooden floors. Daisy moved through the familiar rooms like a ghost, touching objects here and there: her mother's china shepherdess on the mantel, her father's favorite armchair with the worn leather arms, the patchwork quilt her grandmother had made that still lay folded at the foot of her bed upstairs. "Take whatever means something to you," Quincy said, following at a respectful distance. "We've got room in the wagon." Daisy nodded, grateful for his presence as she began to select the items she couldn't bear to part with: photographs, letters, her mother's silver brush and mirror set, a few books, the quilt. It wasn't much, really, for a life that had spanned more than 2 decades. In her father's study, she paused before his desk, running her fingers over the worn wood where he had sat countless evenings, smoking his pipe and working on the ranch accounts. On an impulse, she opened the bottom drawer and reached into the back, feeling for the small metal box she knew was hidden there. "What's that?" Quincy asked as she withdrew the box. "My father's keepsakes," Daisy explained, opening the lid to reveal a pocket watch, a woman's wedding ring, and a small leather pouch. "The watch was his father's, the ring was my mother's." She hesitated, then opened the pouch, tipping a gold nugget into her palm. "And this." This was the first gold he found when he tried his hand at prospecting before settling here. He always kept it for luck. Quincy's eyes widened slightly at the sight of the nugget. "That's a fair-sized piece," he observed. "Worth something, I'd wager." Daisy nodded, returning it to the pouch. "Probably, but he never wanted to sell it, said it reminded him that sometimes you have to try something that doesn't work out to find the thing that does." She smiled faintly at the memory. "Prospecting led him to Wyoming, where he met my mother. He always said that was worth more than any gold he might have found." She tucked the box into the basket with her other treasures, then looked around the study one last time. "I think I'm ready to go now," Quincy nodded, taking the basket from her. "I'll put this in the wagon. Take all the time you need to say goodbye." Left alone, Daisy moved through the house one final time, touching door frames, running her hands along the banister of the stairs, committing every detail to memory. In the kitchen, she paused, remembering countless meals prepared and shared there, the laughter and arguments and quiet conversations that had filled this space. "Goodbye, Papa," she whispered, her words barely disturbing the dust that had already begun to settle over her childhood home. "I'll make you proud, I promise." When she stepped out onto the porch, Quincy was waiting by the wagon, his expression gentle with understanding. He didn't speak as she approached, simply offering his hand to help her up. But as she settled onto the seat beside him, he reached into his pocket and withdrew a handkerchief, offering it to her silently. Only then did Daisy realize she was crying, tears streaming unchecked down her cheeks. She accepted the handkerchief with a grateful nod, dabbing at her eyes as Quincy clicked to the horses and turned the wagon around. As they pulled away from the Triple G, Daisy didn't look back. Instead, she found herself looking at Quincy's profile, strong and steady beside her. One chapter of her life was ending, that much was certain. But perhaps, just perhaps, another was beginning. They made the trip to town in companionable silence, each lost in their own thoughts. Daisy gradually composed herself, the grief that had overwhelmed her at leaving her childhood home settling into a dull ache that she suspected would never fully disappear, but might, with time, become bearable. Granger's Creek was a small but growing settlement, boasting a general store, a saloon, a church, and the territorial bank that now held the deed to her father's ranch. As they pulled up in front of the general store, Daisy noticed several people on the boardwalk turn to look at them, their expressions a mixture of curiosity and sympathy. "News travels fast in small towns," Quincy murmured, noticing her discomfort. "Would you rather wait in the wagon while I get the supplies?" Daisy straightened her shoulders. "No, I won't hide away as if I've done something shameful. My father was a good man who had some bad luck. There's no disgrace in that." A smile of approval touched Quincy's lips. "No, there isn't," he agreed, jumping down from the wagon and coming around to help her. "I need to speak to Mr. Turner about some lumber Mr. Donovan ordered. Shouldn't take more than half an hour." "I'll browse the dry goods," Daisy decided. Mrs. Donovan mentioned needing some fabric for new curtains in the parlor. The bell above the door jingled as they entered the general store. Mr. Turner, a balding man with spectacles perched on his nose, looked up from the counter where he was helping another customer. "Be right with you, Hayes," he called before returning to his conversation. Daisy made her way to the fabric section, running her fingers over the bolts of calico and gingham, considering which might best suit the Donovans' parlor. She was examining a pattern of blue flowers when she became aware of someone approaching. "Well, if it isn't Daisy Grayson," a familiar voice drawled. "I heard you'd found yourself a new situation after your father's unfortunate demise." Daisy turned to find Edmund Wells watching her, a smile on his lips that didn't reach his cold eyes. The banker was in his 40s, impeccably dressed in a suit that seemed out of place in the frontier town, his dark hair pomaded into submission. "Mr. Wells," she acknowledged stiffly. "Yes, I'm working for the Donovans now." "How nice for you," Wells replied, his gaze traveling over her in a way that made her skin crawl. "Though I must say it's a waste of your talents. A young woman like yourself could do much better than playing housekeeper." Daisy forced herself to meet his gaze steadily. "I'm quite satisfied with my position, thank you." Wells stepped closer, lowering his voice. "You know, I always had a soft spot for your father. Perhaps we could come to some arrangement about the ranch, over dinner, perhaps, at my home." The implication was clear, and it took all of Daisy's self-control not to slap him. "I'm afraid I must decline," she replied, her voice cold. "Now, if you'll excuse me." She tried to step around him, but Wells caught her arm, his fingers digging in painfully. "Don't be hasty, Miss Grayson. Once the ranch is sold, there's no going back. Think about what I'm offering." The lady said no, Wells. Quincy's voice, hard as steel, came from behind them. Wells released Daisy's arm immediately, turning to face the cowboy with a forced smile. Hayes. Just having a friendly conversation with Miss Grayson here about her father's property. Didn't sound friendly to me, Quincy replied, moving to stand beside Daisy. His posture was relaxed, but there was a dangerous glint in his blue eyes. Sounded like you were making improper suggestions to a lady who's already declined your company. Wells's face flushed with anger. This is none of your concern, cowboy. Miss Grayson and I were having a private discussion. When you put your hands on her, you made it my concern, Quincy said quietly. Now, I suggest you apologize to the lady and be on your way. For a moment, it seemed Wells might argue, but something in Quincy's steady gaze made him think better of it. My apologies if I've offended you, Miss Grayson, he said stiffly. Good day to you both. As Wells stalked away, Daisy let out a shaky breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. Thank you, she murmured to Quincy. He's always been persistent but never quite so bold before. Quincy's expression was troubled. Has he bothered you before? He's made his interest clear over the years, Daisy admitted. But my father was alive then, and Wells wouldn't dare to be so obvious, now. She trailed off, shrugging slightly. Now he thinks you're vulnerable, Quincy finished for her, anger evident in his voice. The snake, Daisy managed a small smile. It doesn't matter, I have no intention of accepting his arrangement no matter what he offers. Quincy's expression softened as he looked at her. You're something else, Daisy Grayson, you know that. Most people would be broken after everything you've been through, but here you are, standing tall. His words warmed her from within, chasing away the chill that Wells had left. Not so tall, she replied with a hint of humor, gesturing to her petite frame. Quincy laughed, the sound rich and genuine. Tall in spirit, then, he amended. Come on, let's finish our business here and head back to the ranch. I don't like the way that weasel was looking at you. They completed their errands quickly, Daisy selecting a bolt of blue fabric for Mrs. Donovan's curtains while Quincy arranged for the lumber delivery. As they loaded their purchases into the wagon, Daisy couldn't help noticing the protective way Quincy positioned himself between her and the bank across the street, where Wells had retreated. The ride back to the Diamondback was more animated than their journey into town had been. Quincy seemed determined to lift Daisy's spirits, telling her stories about his early days as a cowboy, his first cattle drive, the time he'd been thrown from a particularly ornery horse and landed in a water trough, the practical jokes the ranch hands played on each other during the long winter months. By the time they reached the ranch, the sun was beginning to set, painting the western sky in brilliant shades of orange and pink. Daisy found herself laughing at Quincy's tales, the weight of the day's emotions temporarily lifted by his easy humor and genuine kindness. As he helped her down from the wagon, his hands lingering at her waist, Quincy's expression grew serious once more. I meant what I said earlier, Daisy. You're stronger than most men I know, facing what you have with such grace. Daisy looked up into his blue eyes, finding sincerity there that touched her deeply. I don't always feel strong, she admitted softly. That's the secret, Quincy replied, his voice equally soft. True strength isn't about not feeling fear or sadness. It's about feeling those things and going on anyway. For a long moment they stood there, his hands still at her waist, her face tilted up to his, something unspoken passing between them. Then from the house Martha's voice called out, breaking the spell. There you are, I was beginning to worry. Supper's nearly ready. Quincy stepped back, clearing his throat. We'd better get inside before she sends out a search party, he said with a small smile. As they walked toward the house, side by side in the fading light, Daisy felt a curious sense of peace settle over her. The day had been difficult, saying goodbye to her childhood home, confronting Wells's unwelcome advances. Yet somehow, with Quincy beside her, those challenges seemed manageable. And if her heart beat a little faster when his hand brushed hers as they climbed the porch steps, well, that was yet another complication in a life that had suddenly become filled with them. The weeks that followed settled into a rhythm that became increasingly comfortable. Daisy threw herself into her work at the Diamondback, finding satisfaction in bringing order to the ranch's accounts and helping Martha manage the household. News reached them that the Triple G had been sold to a cattle company based in Cheyenne, and though the knowledge brought a fresh wave of grief, Daisy found she could bear it better than she'd expected. September gave way to October, bringing with it cooler temperatures and the first hints of the harsh Wyoming winter to come. The ranch hands worked long hours to prepare, ensuring the cattle were moved to sheltered pastures, the barns were in good repair, and enough hay was stored to see the animals through the snow-bound months ahead. Daisy saw less of Quincy during this busy time, but their brief interactions a shared smile across the dinner table, a moment of conversation as he came in from the cold. The brush of his hand against hers as he passed her the bread basket took on a heightened significance. She found herself looking forward to these small moments, savoring them like precious gems in the routine of her days. One crisp afternoon in late October, Daisy was hanging freshly laundered curtains in the parlor when Martha entered, her cheeks flushed from the cold outside. "There you are," the older woman said, unwrapping her shawl. "I've been looking all over. Robert and I have decided to host a harvest dance this Saturday." Daisy paused, a curtain hook in her hand. "A dance?" Martha nodded, her eyes twinkling. "It's a tradition we've let slide the past few years, but with winter coming on, I thought it would be nice to have one last gathering before everyone hunkers down for the cold months." She gave Daisy a meaningful look. "Besides, it will give you a chance to meet some of the other young people in the area. You've been working too hard, my dear. You need to have some fun." Daisy bit her lip, uncertain. She hadn't attended a social event since before her father's death, and the thought of facing the curious stares and whispered sympathy of strangers was daunting. "I don't know, Mrs. Donovan." "Nonsense," Martha said firmly. "You'll come and you'll enjoy yourself." "I won't hear another word about it." Her expression softened. "Besides, I happen to know that Quincy Hayes is quite a dancer when he can be persuaded onto the floor." The mention of Quincy brought warmth to Daisy's cheeks, a reaction that didn't escape Martha's notice. The older woman smiled knowingly but refrained from commenting further. "Now, what will you wear?" Martha mused, eyeing Daisy critically. "That blue dress of yours is lovely for every day, but for a dance." She brightened suddenly. "I have just the thing, come with me." Curious despite her reservations, Daisy followed Martha upstairs to the older woman's bedroom. Martha went to a large cedar chest at the foot of the bed and opened it, the scent of lavender and cedar filling the air as she began to sift through the contents. "Here it is," she said triumphantly, withdrawing a gown of deep green silk. "This was mine many years ago when Robert and I first came to Wyoming. I was about your size then, before 4 children and too many of my own biscuits added a few inches to my waistline." Daisy gasped softly as Martha held up the dress. It was simple but elegant, with a fitted bodice, a modest neckline trimmed with cream-colored lace, and a full skirt that would swish beautifully during a dance. "It's beautiful," she breathed. "But I couldn't possibly." "You can and you will," Martha interrupted with the same firmness she used when instructing the ranch hands. "It's been sitting in this chest for 20 years, waiting for someone to enjoy it again." Her eyes grew misty. "I had always hoped to see one of my daughters wear it, but God saw fit to give me 4 sons instead." She pressed the dress into Daisy's hands. "Please, it would make this old woman very happy to see it worn again." Touched by the gesture, Daisy accepted the gown. "Thank you, Mrs. Donovan." "I'll take good care of it." "I know you will, dear." Martha patted her cheek affectionately. "Now try it on so we can see what alterations might be needed." The dress fit remarkably well, requiring only minor adjustments to the hem and waist. As Daisy stood before the mirror in Martha's room, she hardly recognized the young woman reflected back at her. The green silk complemented her honey-brown hair and brought out flecks of gold in her hazel eyes. The cut of the bodice emphasized her slender waist, while the full skirt swirled around her ankles in a way that made her want to twirl like a child. "Perfect," Martha declared, standing back to admire the effect. "Absolutely perfect. You'll be the belle of the ball, my dear." Daisy blushed at the praise. Hardly a ball, Mrs. Donovan, just a simple harvest dance. Ball, dance, hoedown, it doesn't matter what you call it, Martha replied with a wave of her hand. What matters is that Quincy Hayes won't be able to take his eyes off you, Mrs. Donovan. Daisy protested, her blush deepening. Martha laughed, the sound warm and knowing. Oh, don't play coy with me, Daisy Grayson. I've seen the way you two look at each other when you think no one's watching. It's as plain as the nose on my face that there's something growing between you. Daisy looked down, smoothing her hands over the silk of the gown. Even if that were true, and I'm not saying it as it would be inappropriate, I work for you and Mr. Donovan. Quincy is your employee as well, it wouldn't be proper. Martha snorted indelicately. Proper, listen to yourself. This is Wyoming Territory in 1876, not some fancy drawing room in Boston. Out here, we judge people by their character, not by some arbitrary rules of propriety. Her expression softened. Besides, Robert and I didn't hire you out of charity, Daisy. We hired you because you're capable and hardworking. The fact that Quincy brought you to us was just the good Lord's way of working things out for everyone's benefit. Daisy wasn't entirely convinced, but she nodded, not wanting to argue with the woman who had shown her such kindness. Well, in any case, I'm grateful for the dress, and I'll be happy to attend the dance. Good, Martha said with satisfaction. Now let's get you out of that before you wrinkle it. Saturday will be here before we know it. As predicted, the days leading up to the harvest dance passed quickly, filled with preparations. The largest room in the ranch house was cleared of furniture to create a dance floor. Lanterns were hung from the rafters to provide warm, golden light, and Martha and Daisy baked for 2 days straight, producing pies, cakes, and cookies enough to feed a small army. By Saturday evening, the Diamondback Ranch was transformed. Wagons and horses filled the yard as neighbors from miles around arrived for the celebration. The house hummed with conversation and laughter, the scent of coffee and spiced cider mingling with the aroma of roasted meats and fresh baked bread. Daisy, dressed in the green silk gown with her hair arranged in an elegant knot at the nape of her neck, felt both excited and nervous as she helped Martha greet the guests. Many were strangers to her, though a few remembered her father and offered quiet condolences mixed with admiration for her resilience. She was pouring cider for an elderly couple when she felt a presence behind her. Turning, she found Quincy standing there, and the sight of him nearly took her breath away. He was dressed in his best clothes, clean dark trousers, a white shirt with a string tie, and a vest that emphasized the breadth of his shoulders. His dark hair was neatly combed, though a stubborn curl still fell across his forehead, and his blue eyes were fixed on her with an intensity that made her heart race. "Miss Grayson," he said, his voice slightly rough, that dress is, what I'm trying to say is. He stopped, took a breath, and started again. "You're the prettiest thing I've ever seen." The simple, heartfelt compliment warmed Daisy more than any elaborate flattery could have. "Thank you, Mr. Hayes," she replied softly. "You look quite handsome yourself." A slow smile spread across his face. "I clean up all right, I reckon, though I feel like a horse in a china shop in these fancy duds." Daisy laughed, the sound light and genuine. "Not at all, you look very distinguished." From across the room, the musicians, a fiddler, a banjo player, and an accordion player from town, struck up a lively tune. Couples began to move toward the cleared space that served as a dance floor. Quincy cleared his throat, his expression suddenly uncertain. "Miss Grayson, Daisy. Would you do me the honor of this dance?" Daisy felt a flutter of anticipation in her stomach. "I'd be delighted, Quincy." He offered his arm, and she placed her hand on it, allowing him to lead her to the dance floor. As they took their positions for the Virginia reel, Daisy couldn't help noticing the approving glances cast their way by Martha and Robert Donovan, who stood watching from the sidelines. The dance began, and any nervousness Daisy might have felt melted away in the joy of movement. Quincy proved to be an excellent dancer, his natural grace belying his imposing height and strength. His hand was warm and steady when it clasped hers, his arm supportive when it circled her waist, and his smile when he looked at her made Daisy feel as though she were the only woman in the room. They danced 3 sets together before propriety dictated that Daisy accept other partners. She danced with Robert Donovan, with several neighboring ranchers, and even with young Tom from the bunkhouse, who stepped on her toes twice but was so apologetic that she couldn't help but laugh it off. But her eyes kept finding Quincy throughout the evening, and she noted with a small thrill of satisfaction that his gaze seemed equally drawn to her. When the musicians announced the last dance, Walt's Daisy found herself hoping that Quincy would claim it. She was not disappointed. As the first strains of the waltz filled the room, he appeared at her side, offering his hand. "May I have the honor, Miss Grayson?" "I'd be delighted, Mr. Hayes," she replied, placing her hand in his. He led her to the center of the floor, one hand coming to rest respectfully at her waist while the other clasped her fingers. As they began to move to the music, Daisy was acutely aware of every point where their bodies connected. His hand at her waist, her hand on his shoulder, their joined hands extended to the side. "I've been wanting to get you to myself all evening," Quincy admitted softly, his voice pitched for her ears alone. "Watching you dance with every man here has been a special kind of torture." Daisy looked up at him, surprised by his candor. "Have you been jealous, Mr. Hayes?" she teased gently. "Insanely," he confessed with a rueful smile. "Especially when you laughed at whatever Peterson from the bar none was saying. What was so amusing, if you don't mind my asking?" Daisy's lips twitched with suppressed laughter. "He was telling me about the time his horse threw him into a water trough in front of the entire town." Quincy's eyebrows rose. "That doesn't sound so funny to me." "It wasn't the story so much as the way he told it," Daisy explained. "He kept trying to make it sound heroic, as if he'd deliberately chosen to cool off in the trough after a daring rescue, rather than being unceremoniously dumped there by a stubborn horse." Quincy chuckled, the sound rumbling pleasantly in his chest. "I see." "And did this heroic tale impress you, Miss Grayson?" Daisy pretended to consider the question seriously. "Well, I must admit, a man who can find humor in his own mishaps does have a certain appeal." "Is that so?" Quincy's eyes twinkled with amusement. "In that case, I should tell you about the time I tried to impress a pretty girl at a church social by showing off my roping skills, only to end up lassoing the preacher instead." Daisy laughed, the sound mingling with the music as Quincy guided her through a graceful turn. "I would very much like to hear that story, Mr. Hayes." "Perhaps another time," he replied, his expression growing more serious. "Right now, I'd rather just enjoy this dance with you." They fell silent then, moving together in perfect harmony as the waltz continued. Daisy was conscious of the other couples around them, of the watchful eyes of the community, but in that moment, it didn't matter. All that mattered was the music, the movement, and the man whose blue eyes never left her face. As the final notes of the waltz faded away, Quincy didn't immediately release her. Instead, he held her gaze, something unspoken in his expression that made Daisy's heart beat faster. "Daisy," he began, his voice low and earnest, "I was wondering if you might, Quincy Hayes." Martha's voice cut through whatever he had been about to say. "Be a dear and help Robert move the table back in from the porch. People will be wanting their coffee and dessert." Quincy's expression flickered with disappointment, but he nodded. "Yes, madam, right away." He turned back to Daisy. "Save me a piece of apple pie." "I will," she promised, reluctantly stepping out of his embrace. As he moved away to help Robert, Daisy couldn't help wondering what he had been about to say. The intensity in his eyes had suggested it was something important, something perhaps to do with the growing feelings between them that neither had yet put into words. But the moment had passed, and now there were guests to attend to, coffee to pour, and desserts to serve. Whatever Quincy had wanted to say would have to wait for another time. Yet as Daisy moved through the rest of the evening, helping Martha with the refreshments and bidding farewell to the departing guests, she found herself replaying those moments on the dance floor in her mind. The way Quincy had looked at her, the warmth of his hand at her waist, the sense that when she was in his arms, she was exactly where she was meant to be. And though she tried to temper her hopes with practicality, Daisy couldn't help feeling that tonight had marked a turning point in their relationship, one that might lead to something she had not dared to wish for since the day her world had fallen apart by the river's edge. The harvest dance marked a subtle but unmistakable shift in Daisy and Quincy's relationship. Though their duties kept them busy, they began to seek out opportunities to spend time together, a shared cup of coffee on the porch in the early morning, a walk to check on a new foal in the stable, quiet conversations by the fire after the evening meal when the day's work was done. November arrived with a vengeance, bringing with it the first heavy snowfall of the season. The world outside the ranch house was transformed into a glistening white landscape, beautiful but treacherous. The ranch hands' work shifted from the range to the barns and corrals, caring for the animals that had been brought in close to shelter in anticipation of the harsh winter ahead. One particularly cold afternoon, Daisy was in the kitchen, helping Martha prepare a hearty stew for supper when the back door burst open. Quincy stood in the doorway, snow dusting his shoulders and hat, his cheeks ruddy from the cold. "Quincy Hayes, close that door before you let all the heat out." Martha scolded, though there was no real anger in her tone. "Sorry, Mrs. Donovan," Quincy replied, quickly shutting the door behind him. He stomped his boots on the mat and removed his hat, shaking off the snow. "I was wondering if I might borrow Miss Grayson for a spell. There's something I'd like to show her." Martha raised an eyebrow, looking between them. "In this weather, you'll catch your death of cold, the both of you. It's not far," Quincy assured her. "Just down to the south pasture, and it's something that can't wait." Curiosity piqued, Daisy looked to Martha questioningly. The older woman sighed but nodded. "Go on then. But bundle up properly, Daisy, and be back before dark. The temperature drops like a stone once the sun goes down." Daisy didn't need to be told twice. She hurried to don her warmest coat, gloves, and a woolen scarf that Martha had knitted for her. When she returned to the kitchen, Quincy was waiting, a mysterious smile playing about his lips. "Ready?" he asked, holding the door open for her. "As I'll ever be," she replied, stepping out into the cold. The snow crunched beneath their boots as they made their way across the yard. Quincy offered his arm, and Daisy took it gratefully, both for stability on the slippery ground and for the warmth of his presence beside her. "Are you going to tell me what this is all about?" she asked as they passed the barn. Quincy's eyes twinkled with secret amusement. "That would spoil the surprise, wouldn't it?" they continued in companionable silence, their breath forming clouds in the crisp air. The south pasture, when they reached it, was a pristine expanse of white, unmarked save for a few animal tracks. Quincy led her toward a small rise where a lone cottonwood tree stood, its bare branches etched against the pale winter sky. "Almost there," he promised as they climbed the gentle slope. At the top, Daisy caught her breath. From this vantage point, they could see across the valley to the mountains beyond, their peaks gleaming silver in the afternoon sun. The landscape was transformed, harsh edges softened by snow, the whole world quiet and still. "It's beautiful," she murmured, momentarily forgetting the cold as she took in the view. "It is," Quincy agreed, though when she glanced at him, she found he wasn't looking at the scenery at all, but at her. "But that's not what I brought you here to see." He pointed toward a spot about halfway down the other side of the rise. There, partially sheltered by an outcropping of rock, stood a small cabin. Smoke rose from its chimney, curling lazily into the winter air. "I didn't know there was a cabin there," Daisy said, surprised. In all her explorations of the Diamondback over the past months, she had never noticed it. "It's easy to miss," Quincy explained. "It was built by Mr. Donovan's father when they first settled here, before the main house was constructed. It hasn't been used much in recent years, except occasionally by hands who need a place to wait out a storm when they're working this section of the ranch." He hesitated, then added, "I've been fixing it up these past few weeks. In my spare time." Daisy looked at him curiously. "Fixing it up? Whatever for?" Quincy shifted his weight, suddenly seeming nervous. "I hoped. That is, I was thinking it might make a good home for a family, eventually." Understanding dawned slowly, and with it came a fluttering sensation in Daisy's chest. "A family," she repeated softly. "Your family?" Quincy turned to face her fully then, his blue eyes serious in his weathered face. That depends, he said, his voice low and earnest, on whether a certain lady might be willing to share it with me. Daisy's heart began to race, but she forced herself to remain calm. Are you saying what I think you're saying, Quincy Hayes? He took both her hands in his expression more vulnerable than she had ever seen it. Daisy Grayson, from the moment I found you by that river, something inside me knew you were special. These past months, getting to know you, seeing your strength and your kindness, I've fallen in love with you. He swallowed hard. I know I'm just a cowboy with not much to offer except my heart and my hands. But if you'd consider becoming my wife, I swear I'd spend every day trying to make you happy. Tears pricked at Daisy's eyes, but they were tears of joy, not sorrow. Oh, Quincy, she whispered, you offer far more than you know. Your heart is the most precious gift anyone has ever given me. Hope bloomed in his eyes. Are you saying yes? Daisy laughed, the sound bright in the crisp winter air. I'm saying that I love you too, Quincy Hayes, and yes, I would be honored to be your wife. The smile that spread across his face was like the sun breaking through clouds. Without another word, he pulled her into his arms, lifting her off her feet in his enthusiasm. Daisy's laughter mingled with his as he spun her around, the snow swirling about them. When he set her down, his expression grew serious once more. I should have asked properly, he said, reaching into his pocket. I've been carrying this around for weeks, waiting for the right moment. He withdrew a small, worn velvet box. Opening it, he revealed a delicate gold ring set with a small but perfect sapphire. It was my mother's, he explained. My father gave it to her when they were courting. He always said the blue reminded him of the Colorado sky where they met. Gently, he took Daisy's gloved hand and slid the ring onto her finger over the fabric. It's likely too big, he apologized. We can have it sized in town. But Daisy was too moved to care about the fit of the ring. The fact that he had given her this treasured family heirloom meant more than any perfectly fitted new purchase could have. It's beautiful, Quincy, she said softly. I'll treasure it always. He leaned down then, his intention clear in his eyes. Daisy lifted her face to his, and their lips met in a first kiss that was sweet and tender, a promise of the love they would share. The cold was forgotten as warmth spread through her, a sense of coming home that she had not felt since her father's death. When they finally parted, Quincy rested his forehead against hers. I meant what I said that day by the river, he murmured. I promised you'd be all right, and I intend to keep that promise for the rest of our lives. Daisy smiled up at him, her heart full to bursting. I believe you, she whispered. With all my heart, I believe you. Hand in hand, they made their way down the slope toward the cabin, their future home. The sun was beginning its descent toward the western mountains, casting long blue shadows across the snow, but neither Daisy nor Quincy felt the cold. They were warmed by the love they had found in each other, a love that had begun with tears beside a river and would sustain them through all the seasons to come. The news of Daisy and Quincy's engagement was met with delight by the Donovans and knowing smiles from the ranch hands, who had observed the growing attraction between the pair with varying degrees of interest and amusement. Martha, in particular, was beside herself with joy, immediately throwing herself into plans for a wedding. We'll have it here at the ranch, of course, she declared over breakfast the morning after the proposal. In the spring, when the wildflowers are blooming, it will be perfect. Daisy and Quincy exchanged amused glances across the table. That sounds lovely, Mrs. Donovan, Daisy agreed, but we haven't even set a date yet. Nonsense, Martha replied with a wave of her hand. Spring is the perfect time for a wedding. It symbolizes new beginnings, new life. And it gives us plenty of time to prepare, she fixed Quincy with a stern look, and to get that cabin of yours properly fitted out for a bride. Quincy nodded solemnly, though his eyes danced with suppressed laughter. Yes, madam, whatever you say, madam. As the winter deepened, Quincy spent every spare moment working on the cabin. With Robert Donovan's blessing and occasional assistance from the other ranch hands, he replaced the roof, reinforced the walls, added a second window to let in more light, and constructed a proper bedroom separate from the main living area. Daisy contributed as well, sewing curtains and cushions, planning the arrangement of the simple furniture they would need. Their courtship, conducted under the watchful but approving eyes of the entire ranch, was both sweet and profound. In the evenings, they would sit together by the fire in the main house, sometimes talking for hours about their hopes and dreams, sometimes simply enjoying the comfort of each other's presence. On Sundays, they would attend church in Granger's Creek together, Daisy proudly wearing Quincy's mother's ring, now properly sized to fit her slender finger. As winter gave way to the first tentative signs of spring, the preparations for the wedding intensified. Letters were sent to Quincy's older brother in Colorado and to Daisy's aunt in Denver, who had responded warmly to the news of her niece's engagement. Martha ordered fabric from Cheyenne for a wedding dress, and Robert arranged for the circuit preacher to be present on the appointed day in early May. The day before the wedding dawned clear and bright, the Wyoming landscape transformed by spring's gentle touch. Wildflowers dotted the meadows, and the cottonwoods along the river were dressed in the pale green of new leaves. The Diamondback Ranch was a hive of activity, as final preparations were made for the ceremony and celebration to follow. Daisy, momentarily escaping the cheerful chaos, found herself drawn to the river, not the same spot where Quincy had found her nearly a year ago, but a quieter bend closer to the ranch house. She sat on a fallen log, listening to the water's song, reflecting on the journey that had brought her to this moment. So much had changed since that desperate day when she had collapsed by the riverbank, believing her world had ended with her father's death and the loss of her home. She had found not only shelter but a new purpose, a new family in the Donovans, and a love deeper than any she had ever imagined possible. "I thought I might find you here," a familiar voice said behind her. Daisy turned to see Quincy approaching, hat in hand, the spring sunlight highlighting the streaks of gold in his dark hair. "Am I that predictable?" she asked with a smile. He sat beside her on the log, his shoulder brushing hers in a way that still sent a pleasant shiver through her. "Only to someone who knows you well," he replied, "and I'd like to think I do." "Better than anyone," Daisy agreed softly. They sat in companionable silence for a moment, watching the river flow past before Quincy spoke again. "Nervous about tomorrow?" Daisy considered the question. "Not about marrying you," she said honestly. "I've never been more certain of anything in my life, but having everyone watching, that's a bit daunting." Quincy nodded in understanding. "I know what you mean. I'm a private sort of man, generally speaking. But I reckon it's worth enduring a bit of attention for one day to start our life together properly." "It is," Daisy agreed. She leaned her head against his shoulder, drawing comfort from his solid presence. "I just wish my father could be here." Quincy's arm came around her, holding her close. "He would have been proud of you, Daisy, and I hope he would have approved of me." "He would have," Daisy said with conviction. "He valued honesty, hard work, and a kind heart above all else. You have all those qualities in abundance." Quincy pressed a kiss to the top of her head, inhaling the scent of her hair. "I have something for you," he said after a moment. "A wedding gift, though I wanted to give it to you privately, not in front of everyone tomorrow." Curious, Daisy straightened as he reached into his pocket and withdrew a small package wrapped in brown paper and tied with string. "What is it?" "Open it and see," he urged, placing it in her hands. Daisy carefully untied the string and unfolded the paper to reveal a small leather-bound book. Opening it, she found blank pages of good quality paper with a handwritten inscription on the first page. "For my beloved Daisy, that you may write a new chapter in your life's story. With all my love, Quincy." Tears welled in her eyes as she traced the carefully formed letters. "Oh, Quincy," she whispered, "it's perfect." "I remembered you telling me how you used to keep a journal when you were younger," he explained, a touch of shyness in his voice. "I thought perhaps you might like to start again. Our life together won't always be easy. There will be hard times as well as good, but I want you to have a place to record it all, to look back on someday and remember the journey we took together." Deeply moved by the thoughtfulness of the gift, Daisy leaned up to kiss him, pouring all her love and gratitude into the gesture. Quincy responded with equal fervor, his arms tightening around her, the journal pressed between them like a promise. When they finally parted, both a little breathless, Quincy rested his forehead against hers. "I love you, Daisy Grayson," he murmured. "Tomorrow can't come soon enough for me." "I love you too, Quincy Hayes," she replied, her heart full to bursting, "and I can't wait to be your wife." They remained by the river a little longer, talking softly of their plans for the future, the improvements they would make to the cabin, the garden Daisy hoped to plant, the children they someday hoped to have. As the sun began to dip toward the western horizon, they walked back to the ranch house hand in hand, their steps light with anticipation of the day to come. That night, lying in her bed for the last time as Daisy Grayson, she opened the journal Quincy had given her and began to write. She wrote of her grief by the river, of the kind cowboy who had wiped away her tears, of the journey that had led her to this moment on the eve of her wedding. And she wrote of her hopes for the future, for the life she and Quincy would build together. As she closed the journal and placed it on her bedside table, a profound sense of peace settled over her. Tomorrow would mark the beginning of a new chapter in her life, one filled with love and possibility. And whatever challenges might lie ahead, she would face them with Quincy by her side, the man who had promised her forever beside a river, and who intended to keep that promise for all the days to come. May 5th, 1877 dawned with a sky so blue and clear, it seemed an omen of good fortune. By mid-morning, the Diamondback Ranch had been transformed. The yard was swept clean, with benches arranged in rows facing a simple arch decorated with spring wildflowers and ribbons. The bunkhouse had been temporarily converted to a dressing room for the bride, while Quincy and his groomsman Robert Donovan and Quincy's brother James, who had arrived from Colorado 2 days prior, prepared in the main house. In the bunkhouse, Martha Donovan fussed over Daisy's appearance, adjusting the simple but elegant white dress they had created together over the winter months. The bodice was fitted, with a modest neckline trimmed in delicate lace, while the skirt fell in graceful folds to just above her ankles, revealing the new boots Quincy had surprised her with as an early wedding gift. "You look absolutely beautiful, my dear," Martha said, her eyes misty as she stepped back to survey her handiwork. Like an angel, Daisy blushed at the praise, smoothing her hands over the fabric of the dress. "It's all thanks to you, Mrs. Donovan. I couldn't have done any of this without your help." "Nonsense," Martha replied, adjusting the wreath of wildflowers that crowned Daisy's honey-brown hair, which fell in loose waves down her back. "You've brought such joy to this ranch, to all of us. Robert and I think of you as the daughter we never had." Tears threatened at this heartfelt declaration, but Daisy blinked them back, not wanting to spoil Martha's careful work. "And you've been like parents to me," she said softly. "I can never repay your kindness." "There's nothing to repay," Martha assured her, patting her cheek affectionately. "Now I believe it's about time. Are you ready?" Daisy took a deep breath, her hand going to the small locket around her neck, another gift from Quincy, containing a tiny photograph of her parents on their wedding day. "I'm ready," she said with conviction. Outside, guests had gathered, neighbors from surrounding ranches, townsfolk from Granger's Creek, the hands from the Diamondback, and a few distant relatives who had made the journey for the occasion. At the front, beneath the flower-decked arch, stood Quincy, tall and proud in his new suit, his dark hair neatly combed, his expression a mixture of nervousness and eager anticipation. As the fiddler began to play a sweet, traditional melody, the assembled guests rose to their feet and turned toward the back. Daisy appeared on Robert Donovan's arm, her face glowing with happiness as she met Quincy's gaze across the distance that separated them. For Quincy, it was as if time stood still. The vision of Daisy walking toward him, radiant in white, was one he knew he would carry with him for the rest of his days. He barely registered the murmurs of appreciation from the guests or the encouraging pat on the shoulder from his brother. All he could see was Daisy, and all he could feel was the profound love that had grown between them since that fateful day by the river. As Robert placed Daisy's hand in his, Quincy felt a surge of emotion so powerful it nearly overwhelmed him. "You're beautiful," he whispered, his voice rough with feeling. Daisy's smile was luminous. "So are you," she whispered back. The circuit preacher, a kind-faced man named Reverend Johnson, began the ceremony with a warm welcome to the assembled guests and a brief prayer. As he spoke of the sanctity of marriage and the commitment the couple was about to make, Daisy and Quincy stood hand in hand, their eyes frequently meeting in glances full of love and promise. When the time came for them to speak their vows, Quincy's voice rang out clear and strong, his blue eyes never leaving Daisy's face as he pledged to love, honor, and cherish her for all the days of his life. Daisy's response was equally heartfelt, her voice steady as she made the same solemn promises. "The rings, please," Reverend Johnson requested. James stepped forward, producing the simple gold bands they had chosen together. Quincy took the smaller one, sliding it onto Daisy's finger to rest beside his mother's sapphire ring. "With this ring I thee wed," he said, the traditional words infused with personal meaning. Daisy, in turn, placed the larger band on Quincy's finger. "With this ring I thee wed," she echoed, her heart in her eyes. "By the authority vested in me by the territory of Wyoming and Almighty God," the Reverend proclaimed, "I now pronounce you husband and wife." He smiled broadly at Quincy. "You may kiss your bride." Quincy needed no further encouragement. With gentle reverence, he took Daisy's face in his hands and kissed her, sealing their vows with a tender passion that spoke of the depth of his feelings. Daisy returned the kiss with equal fervor, her hands resting lightly on his chest, oblivious to the cheers and applause that erupted around them. When they finally parted, both a little breathless, Reverend Johnson turned them to face the assembly. "Ladies and gentlemen, I present to you Mr. and Mrs. Quincy Hayes." The celebration that followed was joyous and lively. Tables had been set up in the yard, laden with food prepared by Martha and the other women of the community. A space was cleared for dancing, and the musicians expanded now to include a guitar player, and a man with a harmonica struck up a lively tune. As tradition dictated, Quincy and Daisy shared the first dance, moving together with the easy grace of two people perfectly attuned to each other. Quincy's hand at her waist was warm and steady, his eyes never leaving her face as they circled the improvised dance floor. "Happy Mrs. Hayes?" he asked softly, the new name still sounding wonderful and strange on his lips. "More than I ever thought possible," Daisy replied, her smile radiant. "And you, Mr. Hayes? I reckon I'm the luckiest man in Wyoming Territory," he said simply. "Maybe in the whole country." The day passed in a whirl of congratulations, dancing, feasting, and laughter. As the sun began to set, painting the western sky in shades of pink and gold, Quincy drew Daisy aside, away from the continuing festivities. "Ready to see our home, Mrs. Hayes?" he asked, his eyes twinkling with excitement. Daisy nodded eagerly. Though she had helped with some of the preparations for the cabin, Quincy had insisted on keeping the final touches a surprise for their wedding day. Hand in hand, they slipped away from the celebration, making their way toward the small rise where the cabin stood. As they approached, Daisy gasped in delight. Quincy had been busy indeed. The cabin gleamed with fresh paint, its windows bright and welcoming. A small porch had been added to the front, with a swing hanging from sturdy chains, a luxury Daisy had once mentioned dreaming of having someday. "Oh, Quincy," she breathed, "it's perfect." His smile was both proud and a little shy. "Wait until you see inside." He swept her up into his arms with unexpected strength, laughing at her surprised squeak. "Threshold tradition," he explained as he carried her up the steps and across the porch. "Can't have my bride stumbling on her way into our home." With one hand, he pushed open the door, revealing the interior that had been transformed since Daisy had last seen it. The main room was cozy and inviting, with a small sofa facing the fireplace, a table and chairs by the window, and shelves holding books and a few decorative items. A colorful rag rug, which Daisy recognized as Martha's handiwork, covered part of the wooden floor, adding warmth and comfort to the space. But it was the bedroom that truly took Daisy's breath away when Quincy carried her through the doorway. A large bed, crafted by Quincy's own hands, dominated the space, covered with a quilt that Daisy immediately recognized. "My grandmother's quilt," she whispered, touching it reverently. "How did you?" "I went back to the Triple G before the auction," Quincy admitted. "There were a few things I thought you might want but hadn't taken that day we went together. The quilt was one of them." He set her gently on her feet, watching her face anxiously. "Did I do right?" Tears of happiness welled in Daisy's eyes as she turned to face him. "You did perfectly right," she assured him, stretching up to kiss him softly. "This is the most wonderful gift you could have given me." Relief and pleasure mingled in his expression. "There's more," he said, gesturing to the dresser where a framed photograph stood Daisy's parents on their wedding day, the same image she carried in her locket, but larger and prominently displayed. Beside it was a newer photograph of Daisy and Quincy, taken just a month ago when a traveling photographer had visited Granger's Creek. "Our past and our present," Quincy explained, "both important parts of who we are." Overwhelmed with love for this thoughtful, caring man who was now her husband, Daisy wrapped her arms around his waist, resting her cheek against his chest. "I love you, Quincy Hayes," she murmured, more than words can say. His arms encircled her, holding her close. "And I love you, Daisy Hayes," he replied, his voice rough with emotion. "From that first day by the river, something in me knew you were the one I'd been waiting for my whole life. I promised you then that everything would be all right, and I mean to keep that promise for as long as I live." Daisy looked up at him, her heart in her eyes. "I believe you," she whispered. "With all my heart, I believe you." As the last light of their wedding day faded from the sky, Quincy bent to kiss his bride, a kiss filled with tenderness and promise. And Daisy knew, with absolute certainty, that the tears she had shed by the river that day so many months ago had led her to this moment. This man, this love that would sustain her all the days of her life. In the years that followed, the small cabin on the rise became a home filled with love and laughter. Quincy continued to work for the Diamondback Ranch, eventually becoming foreman when Robert Donovan's eyesight failed him completely. Daisy managed the ranch's accounts and helped Martha with the household, dividing her time between the main house and her own cozy home with Quincy. Their first child, a son they named Arthur Robert Hayes after both their fathers, arrived just over a year after their wedding, a sturdy, blue-eyed boy with his father's determined chin and his mother's gentle smile. 2 years later, they welcomed a daughter, Elizabeth Martha, whose honey-brown curls and sweet nature were the delight of everyone at the Diamondback. Life was not without its challenges. The harsh Wyoming winters tested their resilience, and the uncertainties of ranching meant there were lean times as well as prosperous ones. But through it all, Quincy and Daisy faced each day together, their love deepening with each shared experience, each obstacle overcome, each joy celebrated. On their 5th wedding anniversary, as they sat together on the porch swing Quincy had built, watching their children play in the yard as the sun set over the distant mountains, Daisy was struck by how far they had come from that first meeting by the river. "What are you thinking about?" Quincy asked, his arm around her shoulders, his free hand holding hers in a gesture that had become as natural as breathing. "About how it all began," Daisy replied, leaning her head against his shoulder. "About a heartbroken young woman and the kind cowboy who stopped to help her." Quincy smiled, pressing a kiss to her temple. "Best decision I ever made, stopping that day." "Do you ever regret it?" Daisy asked, not because she doubted his love, but because she sometimes still marveled at the twist of fate that had brought them together. "Not for a single moment," Quincy answered without hesitation. "How could I regret finding the woman who would become my wife, the mother of my children, the heart of my home?" He squeezed her hand gently. "Every tear I wiped away that day was worth it for the smiles you've given me since." Daisy turned her face up to his, her eyes shining with love. "And what about that promise you made, that everything would be all right?" Quincy's blue eyes, as kind and steady as the day they'd met, held hers. "I'd say I've kept it pretty well, wouldn't you?" "And I intend to keep right on keeping it, for all our forever." "Our forever," Daisy echoed softly, the words a prayer of gratitude for all they had found in each other. As the last light of day gilded the Wyoming landscape in gold, Quincy bent to kiss his wife, a kiss as sweet and full of promise as their first had been. And Daisy knew, with a certainty that filled her heart to overflowing, that the tears she had shed beside the river had led her not to an ending, but to the most beautiful beginning she could have ever imagined. For in the arms of her cowboy she had found not just comfort in a moment of despair, but a lifetime of love, a family to cherish, and the forever he had promised her that day by the river's edge.